All right, so there are a few things in this human experience that get me really fucking fired up. Hold on, let me retract that. There's a lot of things that get me fired up, but this one in particular is very much at the top of my list. And it is our understanding and our perspective around addiction and those who are substance users. There is a tremendous amount of judgment and stigma and negative connotation for those who have fallen grips to addiction here in this country specifically. And this has been really fostered and encouraged throughout, decades based on the war on drugs and our perception of what it means to be a drug addict or a drug user. And so I want to break a few things down. Number one. So I've been in the game as a licensed psychotherapist for over a decade, and I have worked in some of the most, high-risk communities within this country. And I have also had the pleasure and privilege of working with some of the most traumatized humans in this country. And with that said, not only have they been some of the most brilliant and some of the most resilient and bold humans I've ever come in contact with, but their stories have really shaped their relationship to the world around them. And with that, I have had the honor of being able to not only develop a deeper understanding around this concept and what really fosters a person's pursuit into the drug world, but it's also given me a deeper understanding of some of the biochemical and the physiological understandings or implications that really facilitate a desire to continue to use drugs habitually or compulsively. So let me first start off by saying this. In all the years that I have both been a professional in this industry, and even having had my own experience with the system and being shuffled through it as an adolescent and being on the other side, of the coin, I want to say this. I have never, ever, ever in my life met an individual that uses substances compulsively or habitually that did not have a history of trauma in some way, shape, or form. And this includes all sexes, all genders. So we know that trauma plays a really, really pivotal piece in terms of addiction. The second piece that I want to mention is that a lot of times we push this fucking stupid rhetoric around it being a disease. And I'm going to get into that in a second and why that's problematic. When we look at the concept or the origin story of addiction across the board, for many people, what it really is, it's a lack of connection or a disconnection from self. Stephanie Covington coined it as a chronic neglect of self. And we know because we're a relational species, we ultimately cannot survive in isolation and in disconnection. So whether it's disconnection from self or disconnection from others, and whatever shaped that or facilitated that narrative, ultimately that puts you in a position for being vulnerable to drug addiction. And so it's really, really important to understand this piece that at any point in time, any of us could be exposed or experience an extended period of, again, feeling disconnected from the world around us or having a sense of trauma or abuse or an event that causes us to feel significantly disconnected from our own sense of power, our own sense of source. And when that happens, because we are physiologically wired, right, to be connected to things and other human beings outside of ourselves, when we don't have those connections in place, we will seek out things that offer us similar connections or a sensation of that connection or a false sense of connection, right? Because we need that neurochemical release. And so that looks like drugs, it looks like sex, it looks like gambling, it can look like Reddit or being obsessed with, scrolling on social media. It could look like shopping, it could look like overworking. These are the types of behaviors that actually produce that false sense of connection that we oftentimes get from one another. And although it's not sustainable, it oftentimes does produce a lifestyle of shitty habits, right? That ultimately doesn't serve us in the long run. And within that, we oftentimes are not only facing these physiological responses and these, external behaviors, but we also have the social conditioning and judgment from the outside world. So addiction in a lot of ways has become this not only physiological, but sociological and cultural phenomenon, specifically here in this country. And again, it has been fueled by the ridiculous war on drugs, which is a whole other concept and a whole other video, but we could just say, fuck you, war on drugs, because it is inherently built in racism and has systematically ruined lives, destroyed communities, targeted Black and brown communities, and has really played a very pivotal role in not only encouraging marginalized demographics, but really funding and fueling a rhetoric that's just completely based in bullshit. Again, another story, another video, but that's my little tidbit there. The other thing that I want to mention is that another thing that comes up around addicts and addiction is that oftentimes for any of you, and I know the world of addiction, whether you yourself are struggling or you know somebody who is struggling, it's a really, really arduous road. There is a lot of tormented moments inside of this. There are dark journeys and dark paths that people often undergo. There's a lot of compounded trauma. There's a lot of loss and grief and disappointment and discouragement, to say the least. It is definitely not an easy path to take for the person addicted and for the family members and the loved ones that are around this individual. And this is the thing that I want to voice, again, for somebody that has been working with addicts for more than a decade and who is deeply committed to really propagating a new message of hope around the world of addiction. Know this: nobody chooses, drugs over a lover. Nobody chooses drugs over their children. And I know this message gets pushed, especially in our criminal justice system, when we see, for example, parents who are once again, they're addicted to substances and they're threatened with the idea that they're going to take their children away, but yet they don't discontinue their use. Or for those of you who have ever, dated or married or, had a spouse that had an addiction or an alcoholism, and you perpetually had to internalize this rejection of why are they choosing this substance over me? And what I want to voice to this is that they did not choose the substance over you, and they are not choosing the substance over their children. What they are doing is, in the midst of feeling chronic emotional pain, they are temporarily choosing relief in the face of their own trauma. And the unfortunate challenge with that is that addiction is an incredibly vicious cycle, and it comes with huge ramifications. So I have never met a parent, specifically a mother, ever in my life, that has legitimately said, I chose drugs over my children. Oftentimes, they are choosing temporary relief because they are so incredibly emotionally tormented. And oftentimes what happens is they get caught up in the cycle. And because of the shame and the guilt and the lack of self-worth that becomes compounded inside of this addiction, it kind of sets the stage and momentum to sort of struggle to get out of this cycle ultimately. So I just want to, for those of you who have struggled, and I know how hard it is and how painful it can be and how rejecting it can be to be on the other side. And for those of you who are struggling with addiction, I see you. I know that that's not your case. And I know if you had the tools, or you have the resources, or if you felt supported and loved and encouraged and you felt like there was light at the end of this tunnel, you would stop. I get that. I know this and I see you. The other thing that I want to mention is that part of what we have done, again, with the fucking drug war, is that we have really dehumanized individuals that, have suffered from addiction. And not only have we, again, placed this negative connotation, which again fuels this guilt and shame that often, follows or, is pervasive amongst the addicted community. But what it often also does is that it kind of helps to encourage a life cycle or a understanding about who they are. So this internalized self of being an addict, you have very, very little support from external factors. We all know there is plenty of names and stigmas and stereotypes around what it means to be a drug addict, right? And through that plays an incredible and pivotal role on someone's psychosocial development. And oftentimes the leading challenge with that is that it really forces people into isolation, which goes back to that original statement that I was talking about in the beginning of the video. We as humans cannot survive in isolation. It is counterintuitive to who we are as a species. So on one hand, we have individuals who are traumatized seeking relief because their environment, right, the world around them is not cooperating with who they are. And it could be because they have a history of sexual abuse. It could be because they've been, exposed to poverty or racism. They've undergone some sort of, event in their lives that has caused them to feel afraid, terrorized, hopeless, etc. And through this process, they have lost sight of their own connection to self. And so what we have done is, through these stereotypes, through these negative connotations, through pushing this idea that it's a fucking choice, or through pushing this idea that it's a disease, what we've actually done is we've created a tremendous amount of limitation for these individuals. Because ultimately what we've done, we've really dehumanized them. And what addicts need more than anything, right, is for someone to believe in them that there is something outside of this cycle. They also need to believe that they're not broken and they need to feel a sense of safety again. What we know to be true is that individuals who have a history of trauma have an overactive fight or flight response, an overactive amygdala, the part of your brain that scans for danger. So what that means is, if every addict I've ever met in my life has a history of trauma, then that also means that there's a pretty fucking high likelihood that they're constantly in a fight or flight state, which means they're constantly feeling a threat towards them, or they're constantly feeling afraid, or they're constantly feeling unsafe. So through that process, they're going to look out into their environment for ways to remedy that. And if they can't get that through connection, if they can't get that through the medical system, if they can't get that through family, if they can't get that through their community, they can't get it online, then ultimately what they're going to do is they're going to look for things that give them relief, understandably. So what we do is we push an abstinence model, and we take people who are in a really fucked up place, right? Who are drug addicted, maybe they're living on the streets, maybe they've destroyed their families and their homes, and they're in this really, really dark place, and we throw them in a treatment program, right? And we take away their drugs and alcohol. Now, if they're utilizing drugs and alcohol as their only point of connection, that is a pretty drastic blow to the system, both physiologically as well as mentally. And what this does, right, it's a shock to the system, and it sort of makes crawling out of this hole a lot more difficult, because this is the thing. Abstinence is not what keeps people sober long term, right? What keeps people sober and happy and healthy, and what gets people to correct a lifestyle and change the ways that they are in the world, is that we start to increase not only a sense of safety, but a sense of security and confidence in who they are. People who feel good about themselves, right, don't use drugs and alcohol habitually. So one of the things that differentiates an individual from being, you'll hear this in the NA or the AA community, as being a normie, or somebody who uses drugs and alcohols recreationally, right, drugs and alcohol recreationally, versus someone who uses it compulsively. The major difference between these two groups of people is that one growing group self-medicates, and the other group, right, is able to maintain somewhat of a moderate relationship with substances because of their relationship to self and their relationship to others. That doesn't mean, only happy people use substances and only horribly depressed people use substances, but there is a distinguishing mark between the two, because this is what we know to be true. When people feel good about themselves, when people feel safe in the world, when people feel supported and inspired and have a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives, right? We know that their relationship to substance is far less compulsive. It's often used in such a way to enhance an already good state, or maybe it's done in a socially normative dynamic. What we know to be true is that people who lack safety, purpose, meaning, a sense of control in their world, they are dealing with stigma and oppression. Those are the individuals that are going to be at much higher likelihood to use substances in a more compulsive way. So this is a distinguishing factor. So if I owned my own treatment center, and maybe someday I will, what I would do is I would get people into treatment. They could still use substances, they could drink, they could do drugs. We would give them a safe space to be able to do that, right? From a harm reduction perspective. And as we engage them, right, we engage them in the program, we start to feed them cutting edge material that really supports and enhances, right, their sense of self. We offer them opportunities to feel inspired again, to feel hopeful, to feel connected and safe to those around them. And as we start to bring those experiences into the lives of people who have lost pretty much all of that, then we can start addressing the idea of removing the substance at hand and start titrating down or weaning someone off. But the idea is that we want to get someone into a feel-good place. We want to, increase their sense of hope and self-control and power before, right, we go and remove something that has ultimately been their only connection. You will hear oftentimes with addicts, refer to their substance or their drug of choice as their, as their partner, as their boyfriend, whatever the case may be, because it has served such a critical role in ultimately their survival. For so many addicts know this. The drugs, oftentimes we think it's the drugs that killed people. For so many humans, had we not had drugs, fucking people would kill themselves. People would perish. People would die. So it is the drugs and alcohol that actually, on the flip side, keep a lot of humans alive, because it keeps them coping and it keeps their head above water in an otherwise broken, disrupted, and traumatized world. The other thing that I'm going to say about this, and I'm not going to go too far into it, but the whole idea of creating this notion of a disease model has also been a really, really shitty angle for the sole purpose of this is that, number one, we don't even really have any evidence that says that it's a disease. And part of pushing that rhetoric really was to do two things. Number one, initially. Number one, it was to help fund, if we have a medical challenge or a medical issue, it would be supported in order to get more funding or allocating of monies towards research, right? And we can put more money towards funding and programming. It was also intended to reduce stigma. However, what we know is that, the head person of, I don't know what her actual role is, but she's the National Institute of Drug Abuse, right? They're the ones that really push the concept of the disease model. The person who runs that, right? The head honcho, her name is Nora Valco, or I think it's Valco or Valcro, Valco. At any rate, she has had her own personal experience of having a grandfather who was steeped in alcoholism and not understanding his relationship to it and the way in which it impacted her family, etc. Blah, 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 blah. Story doesn't really matter. The point is that the person that's running the NIDA is the same person who's propagating this message, which means is that it is a biased rhetoric, and it's really ultimately a biased campaign when we start looking at drug addiction. This is important to understand because when we push the concept of a disease and the amount of funding that gets allocated out to different programs, we're funding a $35 billion campaign. When we look at treatment facilities and we look at, different programming inside the private prison system, I mean, we're talking big money here. Not to mention the pharmaceutical companies, which are kind of like a feedback loop between pushing out opiates and now we're pushing out, opiate replacements. So that's a whole other conversation as well. So I just want you all to know, all of this was really, really intentional, but there's a backstory to a lot of it, right? And we're supposed to be putting out non-biased scientific evidence. And when it comes to addiction and the disease model, there's nothing about that that's non-biased. Furthermore, what we also know is that there's not a fucking marker for addiction like that has been proposed. It's been a theoretical concept. There are markers for things such as like sensitivities or impulse control, which again would put an individual or would create the opportunity for somebody to be more vulnerable to addiction, but there's no fucking marker for addiction. So this is another important thing to understand, because when we really push the disease model, what we're basically saying is there's no cure. It's you're one and done. This is who you are and you have to live with this. And what it does is it really disempowers the individual from being able to look at a lifestyle or a future outside of this sort of like, branded letter of who they are in the world. And it also pushes an abstinence-based model, which, let me tell you, works for fucking 6% of the population. Okay, 6 to 8% of the population. It is not a sustainable approach for most of the humans that have experienced or endured an addiction at some point in their lifetime. Last but not least, what I'll say in relationship to this is that, what did I want to say? Last but not least, in relationship to the concept around this being a multi-billion-dollar industry, it also really continues to really keep the stigmas. Although it was intended to reduce stigma, what it does do is that it also reduces this idea, or encourages this idea, that there is an element of choice in all this. And the idea is, it's like either disease model or it's a fucking choice. And the truth is, it's neither. It's not a disease. And what we know to be true is that when somebody uses a substance habitually, yes, brain alterations do occur. That doesn't necessarily indicate it's a disease. Brain alterations fucking happen all the time. If you eat too much gluten, if you exercise, right? If you, start running, multiple miles a day, you can alter your brain chemistry and your synaptic wiring based on specific behaviors. That doesn't qualify it for a disease. And on the flip side, though, what we do know is when you have a habit in place and when drug addiction has become, or drug use has become compulsive, what we know is that the brain alterations do some significant things. Number one, it reduces the part of the brain or the aspect of the brain that supports your inhibitory responses, meaning, for example, I've worked with a lot of CPS clients where we will tell the parents, listen, if you use substances one more time, we're going to remove your children for good. We're going to adopt them out, right? That's kind of what the story they're told. What happens is they so desperately want to be sober. They so desperately want to recreate their lives. They want to heal their families. You put a drug in front of them and what do they fucking do? Regardless of that threat, they use the drug because their inhibitory response has been reduced and has been mitigated over time as a result of the drug use. It has also impaired parts of the brain that support healthy judgment and decision making. So that is true. But what we know, and anybody who follows me in my videos also knows, that in the world of neuroplasticity, right, we can change and rewire our brain with proper support and stimuli. So that also lends itself to the concept of addiction. Addiction is simply a habit. And as a trauma-informed coach and as a clinical therapist, I have watched addicts across this country radically shift their lives. And not only for the better, but they have created not only a new biological landscape as a baseline for them to jump off of, but they've also made corrections both in their mindset and their perspective around their relationship to self and the world around them. So I'm going to finish on this. Drug addicts need hope. They need compassion. They need support. They need people to believe in them, right? They need to know that there's something outside of this experience. And on a macro issue, we need to live in a world that actually supports more safety. When we feel unsafe as a survival mechanism, we will do things to either numb that experience out or to shift our attention from that awareness. Nobody wants to feel unsafe in the world. So it's a pretty understandable concept why people use substances. So we need to bring humanity back into this concept and back into this world because any one of us could be a part of an addiction. Any one of us could pick this up at any point in time. And if you haven't had that happen to you and you've been one of those individuals who has been able to undergo experience and not have to, in addition, experience an addiction, consider yourself very lucky. So I'm going to leave it at this. At some other time, we'll talk about the war on drugs and the hypocrisy and the bullshit behind that. But till then, again, there's a couple really great books out there that I would highly, highly recommend. Michelle Alexander does The New Jim Crow, which really speaks to this concept of addiction and the way it's been targeted also in the Black and brown communities and the war on drugs. And then there's another amazing book that I really highly encourage all of you. It's called Chasing the Scream by Johann Hari. And so anybody who's either struggling with addiction themselves or who knows somebody who's struggling with addiction, I encourage you to check this out, okay? Till then, I'll see y'all later.